left her on the church steps at midnight, in a cold that split fence posts, with a baby not yet a week old, wrapped in nothing but her own shawl. By the time the trapper found them before dawn, her lips had gone the color of ash, and the infant had stopped crying altogether. He did not knock on the deacon's door to ask permission. He gathered them both into his arms like cordwood and walked out into the dark. The snow that December was not ordinary snow. It came sideways, driven by wind off the Bitterroot Peaks, and it did not stop for 3 days. Men who had wintered in that country for 20 years called it a hard one, the kind that killed cattle standing up, the kind that froze the creek so solid a wagon could cross it. In Cold Creek, the mission settlement clung to the valley floor like something the mountains had not yet decided to shake off, and its people had learned to measure mercy the way they measured flour, carefully and only for those they judged worth feeding. She had come to that judgment already worn thin. Her husband, a merchant sailor, had gone down with his ship off the Oregon coast 8 months before, and the letter confirming it had reached her in April, dog-eared and salt-stained, carried by a freight driver who did not meet her eyes when he handed it over. She had grieved alone in the small room behind the mercantile where she took in mending, and she had not known, not for another 2 months, that grief was not the only thing growing inside her. The arithmetic of it was simple to the congregation, and simple arithmetic left no room for mercy. 9 months, they said. The child could not be his. The deacon had stood at the pulpit that final Sunday before her time came and called it what he believed it was, a sin walking upright among the faithful, and he had said the settlement could not be seen to shelter it under its own roof of worship. So they had put her out into the cold to think on her transgression, and the newborn with her, because a mother could not be separated from what she had wrought. That was the night the trapper came down off Elkhorn Ridge earlier than he meant to, his traps light with the season's first pelts, meaning only to trade at the post before the pass closed. He smelled wood smoke and heard nothing else, which was wrong, because a settlement should never be that quiet before dawn. He found her slumped against the church door, the infant barely moving beneath the shawl, both of them dusted white, as if the snow had already begun to claim them for its own. He said nothing to the men who watched from their windows, pretending not to see. He simply lifted them and turned toward the ridge and began to walk, 2 miles through drifts to his knees, into a winter that had only just begun, carrying a stranger's shame as though it weighed nothing at all. Cold Creek had not been built so much as it had been driven into the ground, a stake against the wilderness, 12 years before that winter. Settlers had come up from the Bozeman Trail with wagons full of hope and Bibles, and had chosen the spot because a creek ran there even in August, and because the land flattened just enough to plant. They had raised the church first, before the mill, before the store, before any house but the meanest soddy. A decision that told a man everything he needed to know about the settlement's order of priorities. The church was the only building in Cold Creek with a bell, and the bell told the town when to wake, when to gather, when to bury its dead. For 11 years, the man who rang it had also been the man who decided what was sin and what was mercy, and the town had let him, because in a place where the nearest law rode a circuit that might not pass for months, someone had to hold the line between order and the dark pressing in from every side. The dark pressed hard. Cold Creek sat in a bowl of land ringed by mountains that did not soften with distance, the Absarokas to the south, the unnamed spine of the Elkhorns rising close enough to the west that their shadow fell across the town by early afternoon in December. Wind came down off those slopes with nothing to stop it, no forest thick enough, no rise of earth broad enough, and it found every gap in every cabin wall and widened it. Snow did not fall so much as arrive sideways, and men measured winter not in months but in the number of days the supply road to Bozeman stayed passable, and in the size of the woodpile, and in how many hogs had been slaughtered before the first hard freeze. It was a settlement that survived by consensus and by fear in equal measure, and the deacon had learned, over 11 winters, exactly how to use both. He had preached that hardship was the Lord's instruction, that comfort softened the soul the way a warm cabin softened a man's will to work, and the town, hungry, isolated, 40 families clinging to a scrape of grazeland at the edge of territory that did not yet have a name on most maps back east, had believed him, because believing him was easier than doubting the one voice that told them their suffering had meaning. That was the town the trapper carried the widow and her child away from, into a wilderness that made Cold Creek itself look small, mountains vast enough to swallow a man's tracks within the hour, cold indifferent to whether he made it home by morning. 8 months before that night, she had been only the widow who cooked, and the town had liked her better that way, useful, quiet, unremarkable as a stove. She rose before the bell each morning to build the fire in the mission kitchen, working the flint with fingers that had cracked and healed, and cracked again since November, and by the time the boarders came down for their bread and salt pork, she had already hauled 4 buckets from the creek, breaking ice at the edge with the flat of an axe, because the well nearer the house had gone dry in October, and no man had yet found time to dig it deeper. She was thick through the shoulders and wide in the hip, built, her mother used to say, for carrying children, water, grief, and she carried all 3 that winter without complaint, because complaint was a currency she could not afford. The boarders were 4 unmarried men who worked the mission's trap lines and a widowed schoolteacher who took her meals separately, and none of them thanked her, exactly, though they ate what she made and did not go hungry, which she had learned to accept as a kind of gratitude in a place where words were rationed like flour. She did not think of her husband every hour, though the town believed she should have, believed grief was a garment a woman wore visibly or not at all. He had been a merchant sailor, gone 11 months of the year, even before the sea took his ship off the Oregon coast, and she had grieved him the way she did most things, privately, in the space between chores, while her hands stayed busy with something the congregation could see and approve of. She scrubbed pots at midnight sometimes, when the ache in her back would not let her sleep, and stood at the window watching snow come down sideways over the grazeland, and did not weep where anyone could witness it. By December, her body had changed in a way the town noticed before she spoke of it, and she watched the noticing move through Cold Creek like weather, a glance here, a whisper there, the schoolteacher's mouth going thin when she set down the coffee. She kept working. She hauled water through the coldest mornings of the year, with her apron straining across a belly the congregation had already begun counting months against, and she told no one the arithmetic did not favor her, because she knew already what the arithmetic would be used for. The deacon watched her from the pulpit some Sundays with an expression she could not read as anything but waiting, patient as a man watching weather gather before he says the storm is deserved. She did not ask for mercy. She had learned, long before that winter, that asking only told a man exactly where to aim. The arithmetic came due on a Sunday in late November, 4 weeks before the child would come, though no one but the midwife knew the precise count, and the midwife had been told to hold her tongue. It came due in the manner such things always came due in Cold Creek, not with an accusation spoken plainly, but with a silence that arrived before the service began and did not lift when it ended. She entered through the side door as she always had, careful of the ice on the steps, and found the pew she had claimed for 8 months sitting empty on either side of her, though the church was full and the morning was cold enough that bodies should have crowded close for warmth. No one moved to close the gap. She sat in it anyway, hands folded over the shelf of her belly, and fixed her eyes on the cross behind the pulpit as though the wood itself might offer her a place to rest them. The deacon did not look at her during the reading. He looked at her after, when the congregation rose to file out, and the cold came in through the open doors in a long gray breath. He stood at the threshold as he always did, shaking hands, murmuring the names of children, and when she passed him, he said nothing at all. That was the whole of it. No word, no gesture, only the absence of both, delivered with the precision of a man who had practiced silence as a weapon until it cut cleaner than speech. She felt it land somewhere below the ribs, a blow with no bruise to show for it. The whispers did not wait long after that. They came first from the women who gathered at the well before light, their breath rising in the cold like smoke from banked fires, their voices pitched just low enough to seem private, and just loud enough to carry. 9 months, one of them said, and another answered that the ship went down in April, and a third said nothing at all, which was its own kind of verdict. The arithmetic passed from mouth to mouth until it required no mouth at all, until the whole settlement carried it the way it carried the weather, something everyone had already agreed upon without needing to speak it aloud. She heard none of it directly. She did not need to. She read it in the way the school teacher's children were called inside when she passed the fence line, in the way the store clerk counted her coins twice, in the way the deacon's eyes, on the rare occasion they found her, held not anger but something colder, a patience, as if he were only waiting for the ground to freeze hard enough to hold whatever judgment he had already decided to deliver. The snow came early that year, and with it, the cold that split fence posts in the night, with sounds like gunfire. She felt the first pains on a Tuesday, in the gray hour before the mission bell called the faithful to morning prayer, and she told no one but the old midwife who lived above the tannery, a woman with hands like dried leather and a mouth that had long since stopped asking questions it did not want answered. They moved her to the mission's back room, a low space used for storing grain sacks and broken pews, because no family in the settlement would open its door to her, and the front rooms of the church were reserved for those the congregation still claimed as its own. The midwife brought a single tallow candle and a kettle of water boiled thin. There was no doctor. There was no husband's hand to grip, no mother summoned from another county, no sister waiting in the next room with warm cloths and easy words. There was only the wind finding the gaps in the log walls, and the sound of her own breath, and the midwife's low counting through the worst of it. It took the better part of a day, and into the black hours of the night. She did not cry out more than the labor demanded of her. She had learned already what it cost to be heard in that place. When the child came at last, red-faced and furious against the cold, the midwife wrapped her quickly in the cleanest cloth at hand and set her against her mother's chest, and for a moment, only a moment, there was nothing in the room but the two of them and the small, fierce fact of a life that had arrived, whether the town wished it or not. She named her silently, in her own mind, before she ever spoke it aloud, Ruth. A name from Scripture, though she did not choose it to please the deacon or soften the arithmetic already being done at the well. She chose it because it meant loyalty, and because loyalty was the one thing left to her that no one could take by vote or whisper. By morning, the whole settlement knew. The midwife had not meant to tell, or perhaps she had, in the way that necessary things sometimes travel faster than intention, a word to the woman at the tannery, a word from her to the man who delivered flour, and by the time the mission bell rang for the day's first prayer, there was no soul in Cold Creek who had not heard that the widow had borne a daughter in the back room among the grain sacks, alone, but for an old woman's hands. The deacon received the news, standing very still on the church steps, his breath fogging in the early light, his face arranged into an expression that was not quite surprise. He said nothing to anyone that morning, but those who watched him closely, and there were always those who watched him closely, said later that his jaw had tightened the way a man's jaw tightens when he has already decided something and is only waiting for the proper hour to say it. The proper hour came at the noon gathering when the mission house filled for the reading of Scripture and the settlement's business, the two never far apart in Cold Creek. The stove ticked in the corner. Snow light came thin through the 4 small windows, and the benches creaked as the town settled onto them. Farmers and their wives, the tanner, the man who kept the store, all wrapped in wool and expectation, because word had already gone ahead that there would be more than Scripture that day. He stood at the front with his hands folded before him, and he did not raise his voice, which was, those who knew him understood, always the more dangerous register. He spoke of the 9th month and the 10th, of a husband 8 months drowned, of arithmetic that did not require a schoolmaster to work. He spoke of the grain room and the shame of it, a berth among sacks and rats where a Christian home should have offered its bed. He did not name her cruelly. He did not need to. He called it a sin brought into the mission house, and he said the mission house could not carry what it had not been given leave to carry, and that the settlement's good order, its standing before God and before the territory that watched it for a model of order, could not bend around one woman's transgression. No one rose. A few eyes dropped to the floorboards. The tanner's wife pulled her shawl tighter, though the stove burned well enough. The storeman studied his own hands as though they had suddenly become interesting to him. There was a silence in the room that had the particular quality of people agreeing without speaking, the worst kind of agreement, the kind that asks nothing of anyone and therefore costs nothing, and by costing nothing, does the greater harm. He said she would not sleep beneath the mission roof that night. He said the steps would remind her, and any who watched her cross them, of what happened when the order of things was defied. He said this, as a father might speak of discipline, patient, regretful, entirely certain. Somewhere near the back a woman shifted as if to speak, then did not. The infant, wrapped against the widow's chest, made a small sound, thin and startled, as if she alone in the room understood that something had just been decided that could not be undone by mourning. The deacon closed the meeting with a verse about the wages of sin, and the congregation rose and filed out into the cold in their good boots, murmuring to one another about the weather, about the price of flour, about anything but the woman left standing near the stove with her daughter, watching the door shut behind the last of them, the bar not yet drawn but already, in every way that mattered, closed against her. She did not ask to stay near the stove. She had learned already what asking cost. She gathered her shawl tighter around the small weight against her chest and walked toward the door as if she had been the one to decide it, though the decision belonged entirely to men who had already gone home to their suppers. The steps were stone, and the cold had made them into something closer to iron. She sat because standing too long invited the wind to find the gaps in her coat, and she had learned that too, in 8 months of widowhood, how the body bargains with weather when it has nothing else to bargain with. Behind her, the bar of the door slid into its bracket with a sound she felt more than heard, a small final note in a house built to praise mercy. The temperature that night would later be spoken of in the settlement the way men speak of a flood or a fire, as a fact larger than themselves. 20 degrees below what the thermometer at the trading post could properly measure, though no one thought to measure it until morning, when measuring no longer mattered. The moon was thin. The wind came down off the ridges without trees to slow it, carrying the particular dry hiss of snow that has stopped falling and started moving instead, scouring the crust of old drifts into a fine stinging powder. She wrapped the shawl around the infant first, then what remained of it around herself, which was not much, and told herself this was only for a night, that the deacon's cruelty had a bottom to it somewhere, that decent people did not truly mean for a woman to freeze on their steps for the crime of being left a widow too soon and pregnant too late. She watched the windows of the nearest houses. Lamplight moved behind curtains. No door opened. An hour passed, or what felt like an hour, though the cold had already begun to lie to her about time. The infant's crying grew quieter, which she knew, from some deep, unlearned place inside her, was not a mercy but a warning. She pressed her mouth to the small ear and spoke without words, only the tone reserved for calming, though her own jaw had begun to shake in a way she could not command still. She thought of her husband, the sea that had taken him, and understood with a clarity that cold sometimes grants, that the ocean had at least the honesty to drown a man outright, without pretending it was for his own good. Somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen and unhurried, a man who owed the settlement nothing was breaking camp before first light, his traps checked, his furs bundled, his path leading, as it always did twice a year, straight through the heart of Cold Creek. The snow had begun again, fine and dry, the kind that did not fall so much as drift sideways on a wind with nowhere better to be. He came around the bend where the trees broke and the church steeple showed black against the gray, and he stopped the way a man stops when something in the shape of the world is wrong before his mind has named it. A heap on the steps, too still for sleeping. He was down off the trail and across the yard before the thought finished forming, boots breaking crust with each stride, breath coming out of him in short, hard clouds. He did not call out, he knelt. The shawl had frozen stiff at its edges, ice crusting the wool where breath and tears had wet it, and the cold had claimed it back. Underneath, a face the color of old wax, lips gone the blue-gray of a winter sky, an hour before full dark. He put 2 fingers to her throat, waited, found the pulse thin and slow, but there, a thread refusing to break. The infant stirred against her chest. a sound more animal than cry now, barely a complaint at all. He did not knock on any door. He did not look at the windows, though behind one of them a curtain moved, and a voice, Whitlock's voice, unmistakable, roughened by sleep and something harder than sleep, came out into the cold like a stone thrown after them. You carry that sin into your house. You carry it alone before God. He did not answer. He gathered her up, shawl and infant and all, the whole freezing weight of her folded against his chest, as though she weighed nothing, though she was no small woman, and the cold had made her heavier, the way the dead are heavier, the way anything given fully back to the earth resists being lifted from it. He settled the infant into the crook of one arm, tucked inside his own coat where the last of his body's heat still lived, and began to walk. 2 miles to Elkhorn Ridge. He had walked it 100 times with furs on his back, with meat, with nothing at all. He had never walked it with a woman's life measured out in his arms, like something that might slip through his fingers if he let his stride falter. He did not falter. The wind came broadside across the open stretch above the creek, and he turned his shoulder to it, angling his own body between the cold and the 2 lives he carried, and did not once look back at the settlement, or the man still shouting from the doorway about sin and harboring and the wages of it. The trees closed around him. The shouting fell away, swallowed by distance and snow. Somewhere under his coat, against the beat of his own heart, the infant's breath caught, held, and did not stop. The cabin held its own weather, a stillness the wind could not reach. He kicked the door shut behind him with a heel, and did not set either of them down gently so much as arrange them, quick and certain, on the bearskin before the hearth, the way a man arranges tools he intends to use within the hour. The fire had burned to coals in his absence. He built it back with the patience of a man who had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 kinds of cold, laying kindling in a lean-to shape, feeding it slivers of pitch pine, until the flame stood up yellow and eager. Only then did he turn to the woman. Her coat, her dress, the wet wool at her collar, all of it had to come off, and he did it without hesitation and without a single word, the way he would skin an animal he meant to save the meat of. He wrapped her in the 2 blankets he owned, and a third, made from a hide he had cured himself, and he set her feet, blue at the toes, close enough to the fire that the light moved on her skin like something trying to wake it. The infant he unwrapped from the shawl, which was frozen stiff as bark, and held against his own bare chest beneath his open shirt, skin to skin, the oldest cure there was. He had heard of it from a Blackfoot woman years before, and never thought he would use it on something so small it seemed made of nothing but breath. He did not sleep. He fed the fire until his woodpile by the door had shrunk by half, and he did not begrudge it. He melted snow in the black kettle and let it come near to boiling before setting it aside to cool, and into it he crumbled dried rabbit and the last of a summer's onions, and he worked the broth into the woman's mouth, a spoonful at a time, once her shivering had turned, from the violent kind to the kind that meant the body was arguing for its life instead of surrendering it. Twice in the night she stirred and did not wake. Once she said a name that was not his, and he did not react to it, only tucked the blanket tighter beneath her chin, and went back to the child, whose breathing had gone from ragged to something steadier, something that caught the firelight and held it. By the gray hour before dawn, her color had come back enough that he allowed himself, for the first time since the church steps, to sit back on his heels and simply watch them both breathe. He thought of the deacon's voice still hanging somewhere behind him on the trail, of sin and harboring and wages, and he thought that whatever wages were owed for this night, he would take them gladly, and let the town keep whatever it thought it had saved by turning her out. Morning came the color of ash, and with it a silence that had weight, the way snow has weight before it falls. He rose before either of them stirred and went out to check the traps he had set 2 days prior on his way down from the ridge, his boots breaking new crust on old drifts. He came back before the sun had cleared the pines, a rabbit and a grouse hanging from his belt, and found her awake, sitting up against the wall with the child at her breast, her eyes fixed on the middle distance as though she expected the roof to be taken from her at any moment. She did not thank him. She flinched when he set the game down near the fire, as though the sound of it striking wood might wake some anger in him that had been merely sleeping. He said nothing to ease this. He only built up the fire and set the rabbit to skinning, and after a long while, when her arms had grown tired of holding the child so rigidly, she shifted the babe to the crook of one elbow, and, with the other hand, reached without asking for the second knife on the table, and began to help him. That was the first thing she did for him. It was small. It was enough. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them named aloud. He hunted mornings, sometimes reaching the far side of the ridge, where elk still moved low before the deep snow sealed the passes, and he came back each time, with more than a man alone required, though he never said this was the reason. She, in turn, found the strength to stand longer each day, to stir a pot, to hang wet cloth near the fire, to mend a split seam in his one good coat, with a bone needle she found in his kit, and never asked permission to use. Her hands, when they were not shaking from cold or from something else entirely, moved with a certainty that surprised him, the certainty of a woman who had fed a household before grief and disgrace had stripped that from her. She flinched still, at the sound of his boots on the step, at any silence that stretched too long between them. Waiting, he understood, for the moment, he would tell her the arrangement had run its course. He gave her no such moment. He built up the fire when it burned low. He brought in wood before she had to ask. And when the child cried in the black hours before light, he was often already awake, already listening, long before she stirred to answer it herself. Word travels faster than snow in a small settlement. It moved from the mercantile to the feed store to the pews themselves, carried by men who had seen smoke rising steady from the ridge cabin for 10 weeks running, smoke that meant a fire kept for 3. By the time it reached the deacon's ears, it had grown teeth. The trapper was keeping the sinner. The trapper was raising a bastard child under his own roof, as though it were nothing to answer for. He came up the ridge on a gray morning, his horse laboring through drifts, his black coat stiff with cold, and something harder than cold. He did not knock so much as announce himself, boots striking the porch boards like a gavel. The door opened before he could raise his hand again. He stood in the frame filling it, and behind him the cabin held its warmth like a held breath, the smell of wood smoke, of rabbit stewing, of a woman and a child who did not belong, by every account the deacon carried, to a Christian household. He said the girl must be returned. He said the congregation had a right to see her repent before them, that harboring her here was no mercy but a further sin, compounding what she had already brought upon herself and upon the settlement's good name. He said this in the voice he used from the pulpit, the voice that assumed obedience as its due. The trapper did not step aside. He did not raise his voice, did not so much as lift it above the register a man might use to comment on weather. He said the woman was not going anywhere in this cold, with a child not yet 3 months old. He said if the congregation wished to see her, the congregation could climb the ridge same as anyone. The deacon's mouth tightened. He spoke of ruin, of example, of the danger of soft hearts undoing what discipline had built. The trapper listened to all of it with the stillness of a man watching weather pass over a mountain he had no intention of moving from. When the deacon finished, he said only that the woman had near died on the church steps once already, and would not die again for want of him standing in a doorway. He shut the door then, not hard, not slammed, simply shut, with the same unhurried certainty as everything else he did. Inside, the woman stood near the fire with the child pressed to her shoulder, her face gone the color of ash. She had heard every word through the boards. She did not ask him what would come of it. She only watched him cross the room, take up the kettle, and set it on the coals, as though the morning required nothing more of him than tea. He did not tell her she was safe. He never told her anything of the kind. But he built the fire higher that night than the cold alone required, and outside the wind came down off the ridge like something that had also been refused entry. The cedar came from a stand of trees he had marked in autumn, back when he had no reason to mark them at all. He brought the wood in on the 3rd night after the deacon's visit, 4 lengths of it, pale and fragrant, stacked across his forearm like something he was ashamed to be carrying and could not put down. He did not announce his purpose. He simply cleared the table of its usual clutter, the whetstone, the tin cup, the half-mended snowshoe, and began to work. She watched from the chair by the fire, the child quiet against her, and said nothing either, because there was a language between them now that did not require asking. He worked slow, the way he did everything. He measured with his hands, more than with any rule, sighting the wood against the firelight, running his thumb along a seam to feel for a warp the eye would miss. The shavings curled off the blade and fell soft as ash onto the floorboards, and the smell of the cedar filled the cabin, sweet and clean, cutting through the smoke and the tallow and the wet wool smell of two people who had not left the ridge in 10 days. She had not expected a cradle. She had not let herself expect anything shaped like a future. The work went on past the hour, when he usually banked the fire and slept. He did not seem to notice the time passing, or did not care to. Once he held a joined corner up to the light and turned it, frowning at some fault only he could see, then set it down and reached for a rasp. Once the child stirred and fussed and he stopped his hands entirely, waiting, the way a man waits out a change in weather, until she had quieted again against her mother's shoulder. Near midnight he set the four sides together without nails, testing the joints with his palm flat against the wood, pressing until they held. It rocked. When he touched it, a small patient motion, empty yet, but built for a weight it did not yet carry. She found she could not speak. Not from grief this time. Something else had risen in her chest, unfamiliar enough that she did not trust it at first. A lightness, thin as the crust of ice on the water bucket by the door, easily broken, but there. She had not felt anything like it since the letter came about the ship going down, since the long gray months after, since the church steps, and the cold that had gone all the way to her bones. She watched him plane the last rough edge smooth and thought, without meaning to, that a man did not build a bed for a sin. He built it for a child he meant to see grow. She did not say this aloud. She only shifted the baby higher on her shoulder and let herself, for the first time in 8 months, imagine tomorrow as something worth being afraid to lose. 2 miles down, in the parsonage behind the church, a boy of 15 banked the stove and thought the house had gone to sleep around him. He was not of the family. He only lived there, the way an orphaned clerk lives anywhere, on the strength of another man's charity, in a room off the kitchen with a cot and a washstand and a Bible he had been told to read, though no one checked that he did. He kept the store's ledgers by day, added columns of flour and nails and thread by lamplight, and in the evenings he was expected to be grateful and quiet, which he had learned were often the same thing. That night the wind had teeth in it, and he had gone looking for the extra blanket kept in the study closet, and that was how he came to be standing in the doorway when he should not have been. The deacon sat at the desk with his coat still on, though the fire had burned low enough that his breath showed. He did not hear the boy. He was looking at something small in his palm, turning it, the way a man turns a coin he cannot bring himself to spend. A locket, tarnished, the clasp worn soft with handling. Beside it on the desk lay a paper gone the color of weak tea, folded and refolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. The boy did not move. He had never seen the deacon's shoulders do what they did then, not shake, exactly, but fold inward, the way a barn does before it goes down in a bad wind, slow and total. He heard him say a name, not a name from Cold Creek, not a name the boy had ever heard spoken in that house, or any house in the settlement, in all the months he had lived there. Then the deacon set the locket down as if it had grown too heavy, and pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes, and the boy backed away from the door before he could be seen, the blanket forgotten, his heart going fast in a way he did not understand, and could not have explained to anyone, least of all the man he had just watched come apart in private. He did not sleep well that night. He lay on his cot turning the sight over the way the deacon had turned the locket, and found no shape to it that fit anything he had been taught. The deacon preached certainty on Sundays the way other men swung an axe, clean, final, without apology. He had stood on the church steps not 2 months past and called a woman's grief a sin, fit to be left in the snow. That man did not weep alone over an old letter. That man did not have a name from somewhere else folded into his voice like a wound. The boy told no one, but he began, without deciding to to watch the study door more closely than he watched anything else in that house. The winter did not pause for the boy's private watching. Snow kept falling on Cold Creek in the patient, grinding way of a country that had no interest in anyone's secrets, and the settlement went about its business of survival, unaware that the ground beneath its moral authority had already begun to shift. What the boy did not know, and would not learn whole for weeks yet, came to him instead in fragments, the way most true things arrived in a town too small to keep them buried entirely. An old trader passing through in January mentioned, over cards at the Mercantile, that he had once ridden circuit through southern Ohio as a young man himself, and that he recalled a preacher there 30 years back who left in some disgrace nobody spoke of directly. A woman mending harness near the stove said her aunt had written of a servant girl in a town called Millport who bore a child alone and was shunned for it, while the man responsible rode west with his collar clean and his conscience apparently cleaner still. None of them said the deacon's name. None of them needed to. The boy simply listened, the way he had learned to listen at the study door, and let the pieces settle against each other until they made a shape he recognized. The girl in Millport had been 16. The circuit rider had been 23, already known for the iron in his sermons, already practiced at telling other people what their sins were worth. He had stayed with her family 2 winters running, eating at their table, praying over their meals, and when she came to him, swollen and frightened, he had told her God did not fault a woman for what a man forced upon her conscience through weakness of the flesh. And then he had ridden on before the child was born, and let the town decide for itself who carried the blame. The girl had died young. Some said of the shame itself, some said of a fever, that shame only made harder to survive. The boy raised without a father had grown up on that dirt-poor edge of a town that never once looked past the mother to the man who'd made her that way. The boy in Cold Creek turned this over on his cot at night, the same way he turned over the sight of the deacon weeping into his hands, and found that the two fit together with a terrible neatness. A man who had once been forgiven nothing by his own conscience, spending 3 decades making certain no one else was forgiven either. He did not go to anyone with it. He had no proof, only a name from a locket and the shape of a story half heard over cards and mending. But he began watching the road as closely as he watched the study door now, waiting, without knowing quite what he waited for someone to come who could put a proof to it. The snow came again in late January, not the soft fall of the earlier weeks, but a hard driving weather that closed the road for 3 days and left the settlement digging itself out come the 4th morning. It was on the tail of that storm, when the sky had gone the color of skimmed milk and the wind had finally quieted to something a man could stand in, that the old preacher rode into Cold Creek on a mule so thin its ribs showed through a coat gone gray with age. He asked for nothing more than a corner to sit in out of the cold and a fire to thaw his hands by, and the boy, being the one who kept the store's stove lit longest, was the one who gave it to him. The preacher talked the way old men do who have spent too many winters alone with only scripture and their own memory for company, freely and about everything, and about nothing in particular, until the boy, more from politeness than curiosity, asked him what had brought him so far west so late in his years. The old man said he was looking for nothing, only moving, the way he had moved for 30 years since a congregation in Ohio had worn thin under him, and he'd taken to the circuit roads instead, one town after another, never staying long enough to be asked to leave. He said Ohio the way a man says a word he has said 1,000 times and stopped hearing. The boy did not press him, but something in the offhand way the old man mentioned it. Ohio, a small dirt-poor congregation, a young circuit rider come through years before him and never spoken of again, settled into the boy's chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples slow to reach the surface. He asked, careful not to sound as though he were asking anything at all, whether the preacher had known of a woman there. Ruined, he said, choosing the town's own word for it, because he had no better one. Left with a child and no husband to speak of. The old man's face did not change much. He had the kind of face that had absorbed too much grief over too many years to show new grief plainly. But he nodded, slow, and said there had been such a woman, yes, a servant girl, gentle, quiet, who had done nothing the whole town could not forgive, except believe a young preacher who told her he meant to come back for her. He said the girl had died of it, in the end, one way or another, though nobody wrote it down as such. He said the boy she left behind had grown into a decent man despite it, working stone quarries most of his life, never asking after the father who'd ridden west, and never once written back. The boy sat very still by the stove, the fire popping once, twice, and did not tell the old preacher yet what name the deacon of Cold Creek carried, or how closely it might fit the shape of the story he had just been told. Thomas waited until the old preacher had gone quiet with his own thoughts, until the tea had cooled in its tin cup, and the fire had settled to coals, before he reached into his coat and drew out the folded paper and the small brass locket he had carried against his ribs for 3 days, like something stolen, which in a manner of speaking it was. He said he had found them in a drawer that was not his to open. He said he did not know what they meant, only that a man did not weep over a locket that meant nothing. The old preacher took the letter first. His hands, spotted and slow, unfolded it the way a man unfolds something he half expects to burn him. He read a little, then more, then all of it, his lips moving faintly over certain words, as though tasting them for truth. When he came to the signature at the bottom, he stopped a long while, and the stove ticked, and outside the wind pushed once against the shutters and went still. He asked, quietly, where the boy had come by such a hand as this. Thomas said it was the same hand that wrote the sermons. The old preacher opened the locket next, working the small clasp with a thumbnail gone yellow with age, and inside was a curl of pale hair pressed flat under a disc of glass, and opposite it a portrait no bigger than a coin, a young woman with a plain collar, and eyes that looked out of the tin like she had known, even then, that she was being looked at by someone who would leave. He said that was her. He said it the way a man says a fact he has carried so long it no longer needs proving, only stating. He said he had seen that face across 31 years without ever once seeing it, in the sense that a face like that does not leave a man, does not fade the way other memories fade, but sits behind the eyes waiting for the right letter, the right locket, the right winter evening to be called forward again. Thomas did not speak for a while. He was young enough still that the size of what he had done had not caught up with the doing of it, and he sat watching the old man's face work through something too large and too old for the small room they were in, and he thought of the deacon at his own hearth, not 2 miles distant, unaware that his past had just been laid open by a boy he had taken in out of what he called charity. The old preacher folded the letter again, carefully, along its old creases, and closed the locket with the same slow thumbnail, and looked at Thomas with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something adjacent to both. He asked the boy's name, not the boy before him, but the one carried in the story, the one raised without a father in the quarries of Ohio. Thomas did not know. The old man said it did not matter now. He said what mattered was that the truth, once written down and carried this far, did not belong in a drawer any longer, and asked Thomas, plainly, what he meant to do with it. Thomas did not answer that night. He walked back to the house that had taken him in, ate supper across from the man who had given him a bed and a Bible, and never once, a kindness that did not come wrapped in duty, and said nothing. He lay awake, counting the ways a boy could owe a debt, and the ways a debt could be canceled by a larger wrong. By morning he had decided nothing, except that he could not sit at that table again until he had. The snow on the ridge road had drifted waist-deep in the night, and he went into it anyway, breaking trail with his own body where no sled had passed, his boots filling, his breath going to ice on the wool over his mouth. Twice he lost the road entirely and found it again only by the black line of fence posts leaning out of the white. The cold worked into him the way it worked into anyone fool enough to walk 2 miles of exposed ridge in February, and he did not stop, because stopping asked questions he did not want answered yet. He came to the cabin with his lips gone numb, and the letter's contents repeating themselves in his skull like a catechism he had not chosen to learn. Smoke stood straight up from the chimney into windless air. He knocked, and the door opened on the trapper's shoulders filling the frame, and behind him, the warmth of the room and the smell of scorched coffee, and, faint under it, the milk and wood smoke smell of the child. He told it standing in the doorway, not invited past the threshold, the cold at his back and the fire at his front, and he told it plainly, because he did not trust himself to tell it any other way. The preacher, the letter, the locket with its 2 soft curls of hair, the servant girl in Ohio 31 years gone, the boy raised without a name to put to his father. He watched the widow's hands go still over the child in her arms. He watched the trapper's face do nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. When he finished, there was a silence that felt to him longer than the walk had been. The trapper asked him only one thing, whether the old preacher meant to stay in Cold Creek or move on with the thaw, and Thomas said he did not know, that the man had spoken like someone who had carried a weight a long way, and now wanted only to set it down and be done with carrying it. The trapper nodded once, as if that settled some private arithmetic, and told Thomas to sit by the fire before he walked back down into a boy-shaped hole in the snow. Thomas sat. He did not know yet what the man intended to do with what he had brought him, only that something in the room had shifted its weight, quietly, the way ice shifts before it goes. The old preacher came the next evening, on foot, refusing the offer of a mule, because his knees, he said, had carried him this far already, and did not need spoiling now. He sat by the fire with the letter on his lap, like something that might still bite him, and he laid the locket beside it, open, so the small oval face inside caught the light, younger, unlined, but the same set of the jaw that still sat under the deacon's beard every Sunday. The widow held it a long moment before she passed it on. Her thumb moved once over the glass, not tender, only careful, the way a person handles a thing they intend to keep whole. They spoke low, the 3 of them, while the child slept in the cedar cradle, and the wind worked at the chinking in the logs. The preacher said he had written the letter himself, years back, at the request of the servant girl before she died, so that somewhere the truth would exist on paper, even if no one ever read it aloud. He had carried it since, unsure what use it was, only that a promise made to a dying woman was not one he meant to break by convenience. The trapper said little. He asked what proof beyond the letter would hold against a man 11 years settled in his authority, and the preacher said the locket would do that work. Whitlock's own mother had given it to him as a boy. The preacher recognized the maker's mark from the same town, the same year. Between the two, no honest congregation could call it invention. The widow asked quietly, what would happen to the boy Whitlock had left behind? The preacher told her the boy was a man now, older than the deacon had been when he'd left him, and did not know his father's face, or the town his father preached in. That silence, once broken, could not be handed back to him whole. He had thought long on whether it should be broken at all. It was the widow who said, finally, that burying it further only fed the same lie that had put her on the church steps, that silence protected the guilty and punished the innocent in equal measure, and she would not spend another winter on the losing side of that arithmetic. The trapper looked at her when she said it, the way a man looks at a decision already made, needing only his agreement rather than his consent. He gave it with a single nod. They agreed on the spring gathering, when the whole settlement would stand together at the thaw, and could not pretend later that only a few had heard. Outside, the ice on the eaves had begun, faintly, to drip. The thaw came the way it always did on Elkhorn Ridge, not as a single morning, but as a slow surrender, snow going gray and heavy before it went to water, the creek beneath its ice groaning like something turning over in sleep. The trapper cut a path down to the settlement 3 times that week, checking the traps he'd neglected, listening more than he needed to at the trading post, at the mill, at the well, where the women gathered with their buckets and their talk. The talk had changed. It was not open doubt. No one in Cold Creek said aloud that the deacon might be wrong, but there was a hesitation now in how they greeted him, a half-second pause before the nod, as though some of them had begun doing arithmetic of their own and did not like the sum. The widow's name came up less as a curse and more as a question. Where was she wintering? Was the child living? Had anyone seen her? The deacon felt it too. A man who had built his authority on certainty does not miss its first crack. He preached harder that Sunday than he had all season. He spoke of Sodom, of the wages of sin, of how a settlement that tolerated corruption in its midst invited the same ruin upon itself entire. He did not say the widow's name. He did not need to. Every head in the pews turned, however briefly, toward the empty space where her family had once sat, and then toward the mountain, where smoke from a cabin chimney was said to still be rising. He spoke, too, of the trapper, though not by calling him that either. He called him the stranger, the outsider, the man who answers to no elder and no church, as though harboring were itself the sin, as though shelter were indistinguishable from sanction. The young clerk sat in his usual place near the back, boarding still under the deacon's roof, eating at his table, hearing him some nights through the thin wall, praying aloud in a voice that cracked in places. A man's voice ought not crack. The boy said nothing to anyone of what he heard. But he watched the deacon's hands now, how they trembled faintly on the pulpit rail, how his eyes moved to the door each time it opened, as if he expected someone specific to walk through it. The ice on the creek broke fully on a Tuesday, loud enough to hear from the ridge, a sound like the whole valley clearing its throat. The settlement began, in its unhurried way, to speak of the gathering, the fires, the shared table, the year's first true daylight. No one yet said what else that daylight might show. The gathering came on a morning when the sky over Cold Creek had gone the pale blue of thinning ice, and the whole settlement turned out as if drawn by rope. Wagons stood along the church fence. Children ran between them, loud with the first warm air they had felt in months. Tables had been set outside despite the mud, boards laid over trestles, and women carried out bread and dried apples and the last of the winter's preserves, the smell of it rising into air that no longer bit the lungs. The congregation expected a shaming. That much moved through the crowd like weather. Glances toward the ridge road, whispers about the stranger and the woman he kept, about whether the deacon would finally say plainly what he had only implied all winter. Some had come only for that. They arranged themselves near the steps, the way people arrange themselves for a hanging. Not cruel exactly, only certain of their role as witnesses. The trapper came up the road with the woman beside him, the child wrapped against the cold that still hung close to the ground, though the sun stood high. He did not walk fast. He did not walk slow. He carried nothing but a small leather pouch, worn soft at the seams, held in one hand the way a man holds something he has decided not to lose. The deacon stood on the top step in his good coat, already speaking, already shaping the morning into a lesson, when the trapper reached the base of the stairs and stopped. He did not raise his voice. He never had. He opened the pouch and took out the locket and held it up where the light could find it, and said nothing at first, only let the small gold thing turn once on its chain. The talking near the steps died the way talking dies in a room where something has been dropped. The deacon's eyes went to it. Something moved behind his face, quick and involuntary, gone before it could be named. But the boy near the back of the crowd, the one who boarded under the deacon's roof, who had heard him weeping through thin walls, saw it plainly and did not look away. "There's a man here," the trapper said, "come a long way, who knew a name in Ohio 31 years back." He turned toward the wagons, toward the old traveling preacher who stood with his hat already in his hands, waiting, as he had been waiting, it seemed, the whole long winter through. "I'd ask him to speak it," the trapper said, "before this town speaks anything else." The old preacher stepped forward, the way a man steps onto ice he has already tested, careful but unafraid. He did not look at the trapper, or at the widow standing at the edge of the crowd with the child pulled close against the cold. He looked only at the deacon. "Sarah Voss," he said. That was her name. She kept house for the circuit rider in Licking County, Ohio, in the year 1846. She was 17. You were younger, but not young enough to claim ignorance of what a promise means. The crowd had gone silent in the particular way of people who sense they are hearing something they cannot unhear. "She bore a son in the spring of 47, the preacher went on, "and you rode west before the boy could sit up on his own. I baptized him myself, called him Daniel, for she had no one else to name him after." He drew the letter from inside his coat, unfolded it slow, the paper soft as cloth from years of folding and unfolding. "She wrote this, The winter she took sick, asked me if ever the road carried me west, and I heard your name again, to see that her boy was not forgotten twice, once by his father, and once by history. The deacon's mouth opened, no sound came. She's buried in Licking County, the preacher said. Died believing herself the only sinner in the story. The town let her believe it. You let her believe it. Something in the deacon's face gave way then, not all at once but in pieces, the way ice lets go of a riverbank. First a crack no one hears, then a whole shelf sliding under. His hands, folded before him in the posture he had worn at every judgment he had ever passed, came apart and hung at his sides, as if he no longer knew what to do with them. The boy near the back of the crowd, the one who slept under the deacon's roof and had heard him weeping through the wall some nights when he thought the house was asleep, watched the deacon's throat work and produce nothing. 31 years, the preacher said, quieter now, as though the arithmetic itself were the final weight. A boy raised fatherless in Ohio, while you stood on steps like these and told a woman her child was proof of her ruin. The wind moved through the crowd, lifting a loose end of someone's scarf, but no one spoke. Even the horses at the rail had gone still, as though the whole cold morning were holding its breath alongside the town, waiting to see whether the man who had judged so many would find, at last, a single word for himself. He did not weep the way the boy had heard him weep through the wall at night, muffled and private. This was different, a slower undoing, the kind that happens in daylight, where everyone can watch it happen. I do not deny it, he said. The words came out small, unfit for the voice that had filled the church for 11 winters. He looked at the locket still resting in the trapper's open palm, and something in his face suggested he had thought of it many times over 31 years, had perhaps built whole rooms in his mind where he kept it, and had never once expected to see it again in the cold light of a settlement he had ruled through other people's shame. I told her she was ruin, he said, not to the crowd now, but to the frozen ground before his boots. I told this woman the same. I have told it to a dozen women in this valley, and called it God's word, when it was only my own fear wearing God's coat. No one moved to comfort him. No one moved to condemn him further. The congregation stood in the particular silence of people watching a thing they had trusted turn out hollow, and finding they did not yet know what to do with their hands, their faces, their long habit of looking to him for the shape of right and wrong. He reached up and unfastened the collar at his throat, the black band that had marked him as the settlement's moral keeper since before some of the children present had been born, and held it a moment as though it weighed more than cloth should. I resign this office, he said, today, before this gathering, so there can be no mistake of it later. The elder who had stood beside him through so many judgments opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again, finding nothing in himself to argue with. Whitlock did not ask for time to gather his belongings with dignity, nor for the congregation's forgiveness, nor for anyone to speak on his behalf. He turned once toward the widow standing near the trapper's shoulder, opened his mouth, and shut it again, as though he had discovered that some debts could not be paid in words on a church step in front of witnesses, only somewhere quieter. Over years, he did not yet know if he would be given. He walked from the gathering alone, past the hitching rail, past the frozen ruts of the wagon road, his collarless throat bare to the wind for the first time in 11 years. Before the month turned, word passed through Cold Creek that he had sold what little he owned and taken the southbound coach, leaving before the thaw finished, before the town could decide, on its own, what mercy or its absence might look like for him. The gathering did not disperse so much as deflate, snow-heavy shoulders sagging, as though a weight long carried had shifted, without anyone giving permission for it to move. Nobody spoke of the widow first. They spoke of the deacon, in low voices near the hitching rail, in the mercantile doorway, in kitchens where bread went unbaked, because hands trembled too much to knead. What had he known? How long had he known it? What had they let him do to others in the name of what he himself had done and never answered for? By the second week the questions turned, slow as thaw water finding a new channel, toward the woman they had put on the steps in December. Someone left a quilt at the cabin door on Elkhorn Ridge, folded, no note. Someone else sent word through the storekeeper's boy that the church would welcome her back, whenever she wished it, no conditions spoken aloud this time. She did not go the first week, nor the second. She went in April, on a morning when the creek ran loud with melt and the mud had softened enough to hold a boot without swallowing it, and she went on her own feet, carrying the child herself, the trapper walking a pace behind her and not beside her, because she had asked him to let her walk in first, alone. She stood at the back of the church. No one turned her out. An old woman who had once crossed the road rather than pass her made room on a pew, wordless, and that was apology enough, more than words would have been. She did not move into town. That was her choosing, stated plainly to the women who asked, without apology and without explanation, offered beyond what was necessary. The cabin on the ridge was warm. The cradle was cedar and fit true in every joint. The man there hunted for 3 and had never once asked what she could give him in return for it. They married in May, in the yard behind the cabin, under a sky scrubbed clean by a week of wind, with only the elderly preacher officiating, the same one who had carried the locket down from the north, and the store clerk standing witness because he asked to, and because there was no one else left in Cold Creek who had earned the standing more. There was no feast in the town square. There was elk roasted over the fire pit, and bread she had baked herself that morning, and the child asleep in a basket lined with the shawl that had nearly been her shroud, now patched and warm, and put to gentler use. The wind that evening was mild for the season, almost forgiving, and neither of them remarked on it, though both noticed, the way people notice weather that has finally stopped testing them. 4 years is not long, on a mountain. The ridge does not measure time the way towns do, in fences mended or elections held. It measures time in rings of wood and the depth of March snow. But in a settlement, 4 years is long enough to bury an old story under enough ordinary days that it stops aching when touched. By the spring of 1881, Cold Creek had a new deacon, a quiet man from Bozeman who preached shorter sermons and asked no one about the length of their grief. The steps of the church had been replaced the autumn before, the old boards gone soft with rot, though no one said aloud why those particular boards had been the first to go. The child who had once been left there wrapped in a shawl now came to those same steps on her own 2 feet, in a green wool coat too big in the shoulders, holding tight to a hand 3 times the size of her own. She was 4 years old and unafraid of anything, least of all snow. "Up," she said, and the man crouched, obliging, and she surveyed the churchyard from the height of his shoulder, the way a general might survey a field long since won. The women who had once averted their eyes now nodded from the walk, and one of them, the same who had thrown the coldest words that December morning, brought out a jar of preserves some weeks back, without a word of explanation, only setting it on the porch rail of the cabin, and walking away before she could be thanked. Some debts are paid that way, quietly, sideways, never named. The girl pointed toward the steps, the exact spot, though she could not have known it, no one having told her, and said, "Papa, sit," and the big man sat, patient as stone, and let her climb into his lap on the boards, where once she had nearly died of the cold, instead of the sin no one had properly named. "Father," she said. She had lately taken to the fuller word, having heard it somewhere, and liked the shape of it in her mouth, and he answered her the way he always did, without flourish, "I'm here," which was true, and had been true every day since the 2nd week of December, 1877, and would go on being true. The wind that afternoon was ordinary wind, unremarkable, carrying nothing of judgment or memory, only the smell of thawing earth and wood smoke from the cabin 2 miles up the ridge, waiting for them, warm,